The Fall 2020 Hinkle, Pryor, and Fisher Parent Empowerment Conference. Realities for a New Reality. 2 days, 25 workshops, renowned speakers and presenters, by families, for families, nearly 40 hours of unfiltered and straightforward information, made possible by the leaders in disability rights advocacy for over 45 years, Hinkle, Pryor, and Fisher, attorneys at law. So welcome to this session of our ongoing encore presentation series of the Fall 2020 Hinkle, Pryor, and Fisher Parent Empowerment Conference.
Good evening, everybody. We're just going to let a few minutes pass before we get started. It takes a little while for the waiting room to empty and the main room to fill. So we're going to give it a minute or so, and then we'll get started. Use this opportunity, pour yourself a glass of wine, or it's Friday night after all, right? You know, pour your favorite beverage. All right. Still got some more. It's funny, the people are joining the waiting room as fast as people are emptying the waiting room. Okay. All right, everybody. Good evening. I think we're ready to get started now. So thanks everyone for joining. I hope everybody had a good day at the conference itself, and I expect there'll be a lot more people that join because things never seem so. We'll admit people as they arrive, even if they're a little late. Don't worry, the justice won't. You won't distract her by walking down the center aisle and taking your seat. So, so again, welcome and thank you for attending the Hinkle, Pryor, and Fisher Virtual Parent Empowerment Conference. I'm Paul Pryor, and I'm, for lack of a better term, your host for this particular presentation. And it is my distinct honor to welcome the Honorable Justice Helen E. Hoens as our keynote speaker for this season's conference, who's going to be talking about COVID-19, navigating a world where everything has changed and nothing has changed. We do ask people, before we begin, a couple of housekeeping things, ask participants to mute their microphone. Thank you. This workshop, or it's not really a workshop, this presentation will go for however long it goes, because as a lawyer, I know that you let a judge talk as long as you want to let the judge talk. But I think we've allotted approximately an hour or so for this. And we are going to have a little time for Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to please ask questions in the chat box below if you're a Microsoft user, or I think it's on the side if you're an iPad user. And we will field some questions at the end, at time permitting. So with all that, welcome Justice Hoens. The Honorable Helen E. Hoens recently concluded her services as a Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court, capping off a nearly 20-year-long career as a trial and appellate court jurist. The author of over 100 published opinions in the New Jersey Supreme Court, Justice Hoens has been acknowledged as the court's leading voice on such complex areas of the law as workplace discrimination, zoning, arbitration, product liability, and professional ethics. Throughout her career as a practicing attorney and a jurist, she was chosen to serve in numerous judicial-related roles, which included being a member of the Supreme Court's Advisory Committee on the Americans with Disabilities Act compliance and acting as the court's liaison to the Lawyers Assistance Program and the Advisory Committee on Professional Ethics. The mother of a now adult son with autism, Justice Hoens has been active on the local and state and national levels in autism awareness, advocacy, and education for decades, and she has also pursued and supported a wide variety of civic and charitable endeavors that have involved leading or co-leading humanitarian and disaster relief teams working in the United States, Africa, and Haiti. And during the pandemic, creating an online spiritual support and meditation group. In addition, Justice Hoens has distinguished herself as an inspiring and dynamic speaker, addressing audiences about her son's autism impacted her life and career, how to achieve work-life balance, and how to overcome barriers to success, as well as tackling topics as diverse as, quote, what judges need to know about autism, and searching for justice in an unjust world. Justice Hoens was awarded a BA with high honors from the College of William and Mary and earned a JD cum laude from Georgetown University Law Center. She is a Life Fellow of the American Bar Foundation, a founder of the Justice Marie L. Garibaldi Inn of Court, and the co-chair of the New Jersey Bar Association's Blue Ribbon Commission on Unmet Legal Needs. The recipient of numerous honors, Justice Hoens has been awarded the New Jersey State Bar Foundation's Medal of Honor for her outstanding and exemplary service to the bench and bar, recognized as a legend of alternative dispute resolution, honored with the Women's Initiative and Leaders in Law Platinum Award, identified as a star of the bar, and named a champion of autism. I've had the great pleasure and good fortune of knowing Justice Hoens for a number of years, and I've had the even greater fortune of having worked with her on a board of directors of a nonprofit organization. Justice Hoens is certainly a legit person. I was most impressed when I discovered that Justice Hoens actually has a Wikipedia page that she did not create, right? And that you've reached a certain level in life when you have an actual Wikipedia page. You can find YouTube videos online with Justice Hoens, really good ones and some remarks. And I actually commend them to you, by the way. And I'll say this, being a lawyer is a tough business. I've been a lawyer for almost 25 years now, and it can be very grinding. Especially when you do this kind of work. And the kind of clients that we represent and the kind of issues that this practice addresses, it can kind of wear on you. And there are days that you go home and you can really feel it because you take on someone's burdens and you carry them for a little while. And lawyers oftentimes, myself, no different than others, sometimes need a good dose of inspiration. And I've been lucky enough to have people in my career that I have drawn inspiration from and have been very inspiring. Herb Hinkle, the founder of this firm, is among them. Some of the colleagues that I used to work for over at what is now Disability Rights New Jersey has been among them, Sarah Mitchell and Joe Young and so forth. But Helen Hoens has been one of those people as well. Justice Hoens, as a woman in the profession, when women were just beginning to enter the profession and have a status in the profession and achieve, recognition in the highest levels of the profession, being on the bench, being in the appellate division, and certainly being on the Supreme Court, I don't think was commonplace when Justice Hoens began her career as a young lawyer. And to accomplish what she's accomplished while also having a child with autism at home, I find it to be something that I probably wouldn't be able to do. I find it very inspiring. She is certainly a person of great humor, great intellect, and great humility. So it's been my great honor to know her all these years. And it is my great honor to welcome her here tonight as our keynote presenter. Helen, Justice Hoens, all rise. Take it away.
That was an amazing introduction. Not at all what I was expecting, and I thank you very much, Paul. You're incredibly kind. I'm delighted and honored to be able to speak to all of you this evening, but I must confess that the Zoom webinar format is something of a challenge for me. I do a lot of things on Zoom, but But ordinarily, when I do a keynote, I usually start by having everybody in the audience raise your hand. So, you know, how many of you this, how many of you that? And what that does is it gives me a way to refine who's in the audience, and that permits me to edit or refocus whatever I was thinking about saying before I started. I can't do that in this format. Nor can I get the sort of instant feedback that I usually get from an audience. So when I'm speaking, I'm generally watching everybody in the audience to see if I have managed to strike a chord or not, because that too tells me how to reach them in an important way. Instead of any of that, what I've done is to put together prepared remarks, very unusual for me, and I hope they will encourage, engage, maybe even inspire you. I'm going to pray for the best and leave some time for questions at the end. So you can submit your questions, I think, through the chat, and I'll try and answer as many of them as I can. So with all that in mind, let's talk about COVID-19. For our sons and our daughters, for family members like ours, and for us, whatever our situation was 6 or 7 months ago, we're now living in a world where everything has changed. Or has it? I'm really not so sure that it has. And in that comment, there is both good and bad. We'll get to that in a little while, because first, in order that you can make any sense out of what I'm trying to say, I need to tell you a little bit about my son and my own journey, starting with a sort of thumbnail sketch of what life was like back in the relatively early days of autism. I recognize some of the faces on the screen, so for some of you, this will be familiar ground, but I want everybody to be on the same page. So it's all based on personal reflection and recollection. I am not some all-seeing, all-knowing oracle, so just take my remarks in that context. My son is 36 years old, meaning that he was diagnosed back in the mid-'80s, a time when few people knew and even fewer cared about autism. Truth be told, it was a time when autism was not so much a diagnosis as a death sentence. I remember like it was yesterday, reeling from that gut punch and walking out of the doctor's office, armed with nothing but a fistful of scholarly articles that pronounced 3 dire predictions about what life with an autistic son would hold for us. First, there were jarring statistics that spelled out a near impossible chance that my son would ever learn speech, which at the time was the demarcation line between success and failure for somebody with autism. Second, there were terrifying tales about children who, as they approached their teenage years, overcome with some combination of raging hormones or frustration at not being able to communicate, or maybe just being overwhelmed by realizing just how disabled they were. They turned violent and aggressive. They erupted into explosive rages, and they turned mostly on their mothers as targets for horrific beatings. And third, there were even more terrifying reports about autism linking up with other disorders, things like seizures. And I don't remember that anybody had any statistics about that, but for me, any risk like that was too plain much. I could not wrap my head around how I could survive any part of that parade of horribles. In the end, every single one of those things happened to my son, and they happened to me. And yet, some way, somehow, I managed to create a full, productive, rewarding life for my son and a beyond my wildest dreams life for myself. Now, I'm not actually going to go through how all of that happened with you this evening. Instead, what I'm going to try to do is to use those experiences to try and help you chart a course for yourselves in the wake of COVID-19. Much of what I have to say draws on what life was like in the early years of autism when my son was small, so I'll start there. Back then, there were 3 schools in New Jersey that specialized in autism. And believe it or not, that made us the most fortunate folks who were trying to navigate autism. For a relatively small state like ours, that was more schools than any other state in the Union. People moved here from other states. People moved here from other countries, trying to get a taste of what they thought was a bountiful array of programs and seats in schools. The reality, of course, was quite different. Each of those schools had space for fewer than 50 kids. Each seat was already taken. Other people were stuck on waiting lists. So the promise to us of a free, appropriate public education was pretty much an empty one. For my husband and me, whether it was luck, fate, or as I would say, the hand of God, we managed to find a consultant who actually had some experience with autism, and we hired him to come to our house every week to work with us and our son. So picture this. At the time, I had a successful career as a lawyer, and I had a national reputation as a lawyer. So this guy comes into our house, and he starts talking about ABA. And I'm thinking the only ABA I know is the American Bar Association. Then he starts talking about discrete trials. And all I knew about that involves standing in courtrooms, jousting with judges, charming juries to see things my client's way. And it didn't take long before I realized that's not the ABA and the discrete trials that he was talking about. And I realized I'd landed in a different world from anyone that I'd ever known. The consultant, however, was determined to teach us how to coax speech out of this child, to shape his nonsense syllables into words. This involved, and it will be familiar to many of you, sitting every waking hour on chairs in our kitchen, holding up little objects, trying to get him to say the word. And if he was within a mile of any word that had anything to do with what we were holding up, he got the tiniest crumb of cookie possible. Now, since both my husband and I had full-time jobs, we got our son into 2 separate nursery schools. Now, the real reason I did that was I really thought that if he were surrounded by regular kids, he'd just get the whole speech thing on his own. And partly, I did it because we couldn't figure out how to manage on one salary. And mostly, I did it because I knew I was not cut out to be somebody's full-time mother. And anyhow, I had big plans, big dreams about where my career was going. Nevertheless, both my husband and me took our turns with our son, me mostly in the evenings, my husband mostly on the weekends. Progress was, as all of you know, some combination of 1 step forward, 1 step back, sideways, turn around, over and over and over. But the consultant saw signs of progress, and he paved the way for our son to snag a space in a new class that one of those 3 schools was creating. Problem solved. No, not a chance. I suddenly discovered that just because the school was willing to give us a space didn't mean I was getting anything. I had to go convince the child's study team. This made no sense to me. I had to get the public school to send me to a private school. No sense whatsoever. Now, my school district was already running an award-winning preschool handicapped program. It was a magnet for kids from other districts. But lucky for me, and it was lucky for me, they had never encountered a kid with autism. They had literally no clue what to do for him or for us. They later told me that they agreed with my request to send him to the school program that specialized in autism because they didn't have an option. Problem solved? No, not so fast. The school day ended at 2 p.m., which left a lot of time at night and on weekends, during which we were expected to keep working with him, sitting in the chairs and waving bits of cookie at him. There were no after-school programs. There were only the earliest efforts on the part of the specialized schools to offer a summer program of any kind. And when those programs started, I had to go and ask for them. So I went, hat in hand, to ask for an extended year. It wasn't actually hat in hand. It was scholarly research about regression during the summer months in hand. And my school district again figured they didn't have a choice. When the after-school program got offered, they were not enthusiastic. They started to talk to me about the cost and the other kids and this and that. But I trotted out my lawyerly negotiating skills and got them to see the wisdom of not fighting with me. And it turned out that probably other than me and my scary skill set, nobody got anything without a fight. Shortly after my son started in the school, I found out what fighting was all about. See, the oldest kids in that school were around 12 or 13 years old. And as I recall, every single year, those parents would join together and wage a pitched battle to get the school to essentially create another year of schooling for their kids. By the way, nobody during this period of time was lawyering up, because other than Herb Hinkle, who founded this firm, there weren't any lawyers to hire anyway. So it was all sort of moral suasion, like, you know, you can't send us away now, we've come so far. It's sort of like that scene in The Wizard of Oz where Dorothy gets to the door and she knocks and they say, come back on Tuesday. No, I've come so far. I learned something else from that experience too, and I learned it right quick. Not only did those moms, and it was mostly moms, fight for programs to be expanded and for services to be created for their kids, but there wasn't a single ladder puller among them, not one. And if you don't know what a ladder puller is, that's somebody who makes it up the ladder to the top of the heap, then pulls the ladder up behind them so nobody else gets where they got. It's a winner-take-all mentality. It's a sort of nobody helped me, why should I help you way of thinking. It was something I had experienced a lot in big New York law firms. But suddenly I'm surrounded by these incredibly strong women. They got what they needed and they immediately turned around and figured out how to create it for the next family. And they expected me to do likewise. So no sooner did I manage to get my school district to agree to give me a summer program, you would now call it the extended year, then a couple of other mothers dragooned me into helping create, I kid you not, a free 2-week summer day camp for kids who didn't have any school services at all. And I kid you not about this too. I went door to door in the surrounding neighborhoods peddling cheesecakes that I bought at a factory down in Trenton in a little cart so that we could raise enough money to run that summer camp. You actually could not do that sort of thing today. There are rules and licenses and laws and all sort of things. But fortunately for us, we didn't have those sorts of problems. We just made things work. The point is that everybody recognized that there weren't enough spots in school programs or extended year programs. So almost everybody who managed to get one, in spite of still having to work day and night with their own child, turned around and started creating whatever opportunities for other parents that they could. Parents were the moving force behind Autism NJ. It started out maybe 45 years ago as a parent-run service called COSAC, the Center for Outreach and Services for Autistic Children. They had a hotline, they had a clearinghouse of information about programs and special education rights, they ran free seminars, and they put together an annual conference. Believe me, it was a godsend to people like me, and it was the envy of parents all across the country. Eventually, parents were also the impetus behind starting more schools that were devoted to kids like ours and families like ours. So those first 3 schools over time were joined by more. But it wasn't enough. The folks in the Department of Education, actually the Division of Special Education within that department, recognized that the incidence of autism here in New Jersey was rising, and it was rising faster than schools were being developed. There were a lot of reasons why that happened. Part of it was an expansion in the diagnostic criteria, And part of it here in New Jersey was doctors coming out of medical school who not only studied autism, but had actually had interactions with people on the spectrum. For whatever reason the incidence went up, the Division of Special Education realized they needed to ramp up school services, and they need to do it quickly. So, and I know this because I was a member of the State Parents Advisory Council on the Handicapped at the time. The division decided to offer seed grants as an incentive to school districts to start autism programs in district. And they'd have to get the money to start their program, but they had to agree to take kids from other districts that didn't have their own programs. My school district, remember them? When my son was around 9, I think, they did create their own in-district school program, partly because by that time they had about 7 or 8 kids on the spectrum that were being served in these private schools, but mostly because they already had 4 or 5 more kids knocking on the door for a program, so they had plenty to start their own. Now, that still doesn't mean that parents were content to sit back and rest, because while all that was going on, the parents of kids older than mine were approaching or had already approached and had to deal with the cliff. That's the cliff that they encountered when the school years ended for their sons and daughters. And it was a cliff because everybody gets a free appropriate public education because of federal and state law entitlements, but nobody gets adult services without a struggle. Not then, and pretty much not now either, from what I can tell. So that same group of parents, even before my son was diagnosed and got into one of those 3 schools, had been pressing to have adult programs created. At the time, there were some programs in New Jersey. I recall there were about 6 developmental centers, which were, they served adults of all kinds, but they also served autistic adults and teenagers with autism whose behaviors couldn't be managed in schools or at home. There were a couple of other organizations that also had big places where they served people. There were places outside of New Jersey where people were sent. Some of them had a big campus which had a large institutional piece, and then smaller cottages that were all attached to the larger, but they were all basically believed, and I thought so too, institutional settings. There was precisely one program at the time here in New Jersey that not only was operating one of the 3 schools, but that had already stepped up to meet the challenge of creating adult programs. More to the point, that program had embraced what was then cutting-edge thinking about services to adults that was based on small group homes that were embedded in communities, and it began to create those services. I first encountered that program and the visionaries who were running it because, believe it or not, since I was the only person anyone had met who was both a parent and an accomplished attorney, I was being asked to serve on boards in all sorts of organizations, not only here in New Jersey, but across the country. So by that time, that one program had already started a group home, and they had started an adult employment center where folks were learning job skills, they were doing some work on site, but some of them were starting to get real jobs. My son wasn't in that school, but I tell you, I got one glance at those programs, and I took probably the first hard, honest look at my son's enormous deficits, and I realized that his best chance for a future was one that included adult services of the kind that they were offering in that program. So I moved heaven and earth to move him from the other program into the school that they were running. Of course, getting him into the school was only the start of a prolonged battle for an actual place in a group home and an adult employment program. And I will tell you, it took every ounce of strength and every scrap of ingenuity that I had to pull it off. But in a very real sense, it has been a dream come true for me and for our son. Most of the other parents I know throughout that, or knew throughout that part of my journey, weren't so determined, or maybe so creative, or maybe just not so lucky. Because a big part of that system involved getting onto and navigating upward on what was called the waiting list for adult services. It wasn't a list limited to people with autism. It included every sort of disability you could imagine. And it involved long spans of time where all you did was wait, because nobody in the governor's office devoted funding to getting anyone off the waiting list. It grew and it grew and it grew and it grew until eventually it was done away with. Sort of. It was sort of done away with, as far as I can tell. But not before adult services also began to evolve. Parents started to get really creative in their approach to services. Some of them banded together and applied for individual funding under DDD's self-determination program. Then they pooled those funds together and set up what amounted to their own group homes. Others accessed affordable housing. Some contracted for services from existing providers. Others literally created their own foundations to raise money to start homes for their own kids and for other kids as well. Long before my son got onto the waiting list, when he was 10 years old, my life changed dramatically. I was appointed to a seat as a Superior Court judge and began the career that culminated with my elevation to the New Jersey Supreme Court. And the only reason I tell you that is that the Code of Judicial Ethics here in New Jersey is the strictest in the nation. And it required me to stop all of my autism-related advocacy efforts and to step off all of the boards of all of the organizations on which I was a volunteer. I could still talk one-on-one with other parents that I knew, or parents who found me, offered them a bit of motherly advice. I could still speak at seminars relating to autism. I could write articles of my personal reflections. I could teach judges about autism. And I could obviously, very quietly, advocate for my own child to get on and then to trudge up that waiting list. But I kind of had to give up my front row seat on all things autism. Not that I hid the fact of my son's autism. In fact, his extraordinary deficits and my struggle with them were impossible to keep secret. And it was particularly no secret once I became a justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court. You see, the governor, when he announced my nomination, he listed a bunch of qualities he said set me apart from everybody else and made me the perfect choice, in his words. Patience, compassion, strength, courage. Not one of those words would I have used to describe myself. But as I reflected on what he said, I realized that in fact I had developed all of those qualities, and I developed them all by living with my son. So at my ceremonial swearing in, rather than do what everybody else does and give a speech thanking people, I was standing there wondering what I would say. I had not been able to write a proper speech. I had no clue what was going to come out of my mouth when I stepped up to the microphone and heard myself in an entirely unscripted presentation. I heard myself giving a speech about how folks like my son, families like mine, families like ours, live their lives shoved in the shadows, stuck in the margins of society. But it was there, traveling that road with my son, seeing how society treats people like him, people like me that I developed all those qualities that the governor celebrated about me. That speech went viral before there was viral. I got calls from people all over the country, and I was told by our then Senate president at the time that my speech was the reason that long stalled legislation creating insurance coverage rights for all of us actually got passed. Now, the outgrowth of that speech was that pretty much everybody, or at least everybody in the judiciary and state government and the legal profession and everybody in autism knew something about my life's journey. So I'd be asked to be at a seminar talking to lawyers or law students or high school kids or whatever. And I was supposed to be talking about cognitive bias and workplace discrimination, or zoning and land use, or maybe about the New Jersey state constitution. And we'd open it up for question, or we'd break for refreshments, and I'd look up and here's this line of young women all wanting to talk to me. And what they wanted to talk to me about was, how did I achieve work-life balance with that in my life? Or could I give them some advice on finding some services for their family member? So I might have left autism, but it never left me. So why the extended foray into ancient history? What does any of this have to do with you? What does it have to do with COVID-19? Actually, everything. Over the past 5 or 10 years, the people who have reached out to me when they're facing an autism diagnosis have changed a bit. The conversations are different from what they once were. Rather than wanting to know how to find a place in one of those schools, it seems like everybody these days just phones the child study team. Bingo. Oh, we have a place for Johnny right here in the neighborhood school. Oh, there's no wait. There's no need to fight. And from what I can tell, there were dozens of schools all over the state. Extended day, extended year, OT, PT, adaptive PE, sophisticated communications programs, and home programming services. And most of that didn't exist when my son was small. And if it did, you didn't get that without a struggle. Some of those programs now are fully inclusive with kids like mine in a regular school classroom, maybe with a one-on-one aide. Maybe they have a few classes where they're pulled out during the day. And by the way, those programs were also the doing of parents. Parents wanted their kids to be fully included in those classes rather than kept apart in segregated settings. Other programs still are separate, and they may offer even more services for kids who, like mine, are harder to manage. In addition, however, over time, the laws changed. The laws changed to require that every program include transition planning. So at a minimum, every program has to focus on what life will be like for little Johnny when the school program ends. Maybe it's job training. Maybe it's job sampling or coaching. Maybe it's learning how to ride the bus. None of that stuff existed back then, hence the cliff. Candidly, I hadn't paid too much attention to any of those developments. Those programs and services came long after my son didn't need them. And for the most part, for the longest time, it seemed as though anything that I endured back in the day was not relevant to anybody today. Oh, of course, I was aware that DDD had altered the way in which adult services are provided. There were those parents I knew who seemed to do nothing but wait for services, came to me for some of that mother-to-mother advice. There were aging parents with adults living at home who all of a sudden decided they'd better find some services before they passed away and left their kid desperate and terrified. But it seemed that accessing adult services presented some challenges, maybe even a struggle, but it seemed to me there was some kind of a workable situation in light of the fact that those parent advocates had never actually found the right moment to start what we always wanted to do, which was to push for an adult entitlement. The very mention of that was always a political non-starter. So we had this system. All in all, here in New Jersey, it seemed to me that we had a robust system of education, and we do. And we had an imperfect but growing array of adult services. And then COVID-19 came along. And it hit everybody like the proverbial ton of bricks. For the vast majority of people on the spectrum and their families, whatever you had disappeared in a nanosecond. No school, no adult day service, a sudden shift to some version of online learning without the much needed structure and supports you'd come to count on, and maybe without access to the technology that you needed to participate. My very first words when this started happening were to my husband. I said that if any of that had happened to us when our son lived at home, I would not have survived. Not just because of the beatings and all of that sort of thing and the demands of a full-time job, but my son was incapable of interacting with anything that involved a screen. He didn't watch the TV. We couldn't get him to use a computer. Nothing until a decade ago when I took the initiative to create an interest in him in iPad technology and began my great push for adult communication services. I couldn't stop wondering when I heard about what was going on with COVID-19, how any parent could manage. And the recent stories on the front page of the Star Ledger, if you saw them, they confirmed my fears. That and a new round of desperate phone calls I started receiving, a mixture of parents who were literally in the same boat I would have been in, grandparents of newly diagnosed kids whose child study team evaluations just stopped in midstream, and even families with adult sons and daughters so high on the spectrum, they'd been living and working independently, suddenly thrust out of jobs, stuck in an apartment with nothing but terrible news all day on the TV about this dread disease that was going to kill all the old people. Yeah, for the great majority of those on the spectrum, the pandemic has cost them everything. A few parents apparently coped. Some had the help of siblings or other family members. Some even managed to find consultants and hire them to come in, kind of like me way back in the day when the consultant came to our house. It was like all of a sudden, all of you got shoved into the dark ages where we had survived for so long with nothing. And even now, with the schools starting to reopen, they're not the same. It's probably not a full day, let alone an extended day. It's partly live, partly remote, maybe all remote. There may be no busing if your son or daughter doesn't walk to the neighborhood school. And if your son or daughter had adult services, well, they're all different too. If you were lucky, if you were very lucky, your son or daughter was locked down in a group home, but all the adults lost whatever day program they had, whatever job they had, a tough lesson that us old timers know about our kids being the last hired and the first fired. How many job skills will they have to relearn? How many of our family members will be able to tolerate wearing a mask? How many of them won't go along touching everything and then picking their nose, for Pete's sake, or rubbing their eyes? How many of them can wash their hands thoroughly? The newspapers commented that the kids in the schools had lost 3 months. I guess they meant from March to June, the end of the regular school year, but that's not even close to true. Our kids lost the summer as well, and they're still losing today. So everything's changed, and not in a good way. Or has it? In a very real sense, nothing has changed at all. And there is both good and bad in that observation. The harsh truth of it is, many of you have been thrust into a place where so many of us spent so many early years of our lives in autism. A world where, in a very real sense, the breadth of the spectrum is vast, the needs of everyone are diverse, the services for anyone are in short supply, and nobody's getting anything without a fight. But there is good news. See, the hardest working autism mom I know is one of those old timers. She's a real war horse, you know, one of those ones fearlessly galloping headlong into the fray, nerves of iron. In the midst of the pandemic, she was in the forefront of the battle to make sure that there was funding for frontline workers in group homes. Not a week went by that I didn't get at least one blast email from her telling me, contact my senator, write to my congressman, call the governor, get the legislative leaders going. We have to push for legislation and funding that'll keep the folks locked down in the group homes safe by making sure that the direct service professionals who are with them 24/7 are paid. Maybe those of you who aren't lucky enough to have a family member in a group home think that's a silly thing to even be talking about, but here's the point. Folks like me still have leadership of folks like her, old war horses. Some of us even are old war horses. And the good news is that every single one of us started out where you are now. We figured out how to advocate for our own family members, and then we turned around and advocated for everybody else's too. And so can all of you. It's okay to start acting like this is every man for himself. It's okay to start thinking every mom for herself. But it's also the time for you to step forward like we did, to find the opportunity in the midst of the crisis, to use this pandemic to join together and come up with a plan for how we collectively can also identify common goals and advocate for every family touched by autism to secure what all of us need. How do we do that? I will candidly admit to you, I don't know what any of you need, either now or down the line. I can't begin to figure out how anybody makes up for the time lost from school and from services. But I bet there are those among you who either do know or have a whole lot of ideas about how that might happen. So start with what would benefit your own child and advocate for that. Then, if it's something others could also benefit from, don't be a ladder puller. Turn around and help the next family as well. And if you're interested, I'm willing to help you get the ball rolling. I put together a short survey. It simply asks mostly for demographic information. How, school-age kid, adult, child, what services you had, what services you lost, what you've gotten back. And there's a question in there about what do you think you need? What do you think everybody needs? Are you willing to help? I have a couple of ideas of things that might help, but I didn't want to poison anybody's mind or put ideas in other people's heads. So I didn't put any ideas. It's just open-ended. What do you think we need? What I'm hoping is that looking at that, we get some solid demographic information, and we also get some real good leads about how we can move forward, what we can move forward with. And I also hope that there are people who are willing to step up and say, yeah, I can help with that. Participating in that survey is entirely voluntary. It's entirely anonymous. If you want to step up, I'm happy to see what I can do to help all of you. Whatever you decide to do, please take a page from history. Please learn from the old war horses whose efforts, not only for their own family members, but for the rest of us, made such immense progress possible for everyone. Because the time is now for a new generation, for your generation, to come together, to work together, to change the world for people with autism. And I thank you. See, now I would ordinarily be hearing applause, and that's the other thing about see people clapping. That's the thing about the webinar. You sort of sit there and you say,
Everybody unmute their camera and start clapping, all right? Told you she would be inspiring. So
I see people I know.
I want your contact information. I have a serious issue to handle.
Very,
Your Honor.
very
I
good.
love you. Job. Great job. I have a mama question, Your Honor.
wait, whoops. Let's fill up the chat box with some questions, and I'll funnel them to her, but to Justice Hoens. But I will say this, Justice. I've never cried in court, although listening to a judge, but I've often wanted to.
Well, there are reasons for that, Paul. We can talk later.
Yeah, I mean, you can take that however you want. Okay. So, but you know, I've heard you talk a lot, and you know, I always think like this time she's not going to get at me. She's not going to get at my heartstrings. She's not going to make me emotional. But you know, damn it, you always do. So, thank you, Justice Hoens, for a lot of great content. You know, and making us feel better about the circumstances that we live in and the messages of hope and inspiration. So, I will take, you know, folks, please feed some questions if you've got them. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, including a couple of advanced questions. So in keeping with the last, you know, sort of bit of your remarks, you know, we're fortunate enough to have a question that has been asked about what do you really perceive as the narrow issues that are at the forefront for parents today, you know, and what advice would you give parents who do want to organize, you know, young parents who do want to organize? How do they go about getting that stuff done in this era we live in?
It kind of depends upon where you are in the process. My sense is that a lot of people get so many services in school that they're accustomed to just getting services. What's happened in the pandemic is now you're living with pretty much none of that. I think everybody is looking at at least 6 or maybe 8 or 10 by the time we're done month-long window when you really didn't get stuff. So you've fallen behind of what everything you had. In terms of one of the reasons that I put together the survey is I don't know more precisely than that what people need. And one of the things I'm hoping is that I can find some common ground, some common themes, and maybe then start saying, okay, well, if this is the goal, how do we do that? Is this going to be every man for himself, or is a way that we can say, wait a minute, everybody should get that? I mean, and how do you do that? Whether it's a legislative solution or something of that nature, I can't tell you right now. But that's why I decided to put together the little survey, because you know infinitely more about what your needs are, no matter where you are in terms of the age of your son or daughter, or where you are on the spectrum.
Fortunately, we got a question about, you know, you had touched upon, you know, the joke of, you know, you lost some services between March and June, but the reality is that, you know, school age kids have lost services for, you know, much longer than that. What do you, I mean, really, we see a lot of that too internally in our practice, that kids are needing compensatory education services. They've really fallen very far behind. Do you have any thoughts on maybe what some of the potential solutions or strategies to address that might be?
I do. I did not really want to mention it to people. I mean, it seems to me that if what we're talking about is compensatory services for school-age kids or kids who didn't even get through the child study team evaluation process in time, is to look for a legislative solution, potentially go to the legislature and say, everybody lost a year. How about we just create an extra year for everybody? And then, you can either say, gee, I don't need that, good for you, or everybody would just have that additional makeup time. Will it make everything perfect? No. If you had a 3-year-old and you missed the 3-year-old year, you may need more than that. And that might not be everything, but that would take, if people were interested in pursuing something like that, it would take figuring out how to draft a bill, finding some sponsors, who knows somebody who's actually in charge down there, and whatnot. That's the only idea that I had, and I don't know if anybody else thinks it's interesting. So there you go.
Well, that's great. And who's in charge down there? As an aside, guys, we just discovered that we did have a technical glitch. I was supposed to be the host for this session, and somehow, Justice, you ended up being the host for this session. So all the questions went to you, and they didn't go to me. So guys, if you had questions, could you please quickly resubmit them so that they come to me so I can pitch them over to Justice Hoens? Sorry for the inconvenience, but
I did see one pop up, and it was a question about how do you access the survey. I sent a link for the survey to Mr. Pryor's office, and I asked him to test drive it to make sure that it actually works before he pushes it out to all of you. But the idea was that anybody who's on this presentation will get it. You open it, I'm going to tell him to send an actual email that says, this is actually the link for Justice Hoens, so it's legit. So if you don't want to do it, just don't do it. Just delete. It's not going to hurt my feelings. So I did see that one. Yes. And that you should get in the next few days.
Yes. And so, Justice, you don't have to call me Mr. Pryor because, I don't deserve, compared to whatever, I don't deserve that level of honor. But yeah, questions are starting to come in. I will say this, is that the survey, yes, we did test drive it, Justice. It does work. And just so folks understand, all of us here at the firm, my colleague Maria Fisher and I and all the other lawyers here at the firm, we love this idea, and we will support this idea. We will back this idea. We will be sending a link to the survey out to the over 600 people that did register for this conference. Right. You don't know how many people will respond, but my understanding of the surveys is the response rate is pretty, low in terms of the percentage wise, but that's still good. It's like baseball. If you succeed a third of the time, you're going to make it to the Hall of Fame. So we will send that out over the course of the next couple of days, and let's see what we learn. And Justice was kind enough to put it all together. I am getting wickedly bombarded with questions at this point, so this is awesome. So
don't ask me any hard ones.
It never stopped you from asking hard questions, Judge. So I will. One of the questions is, what was it like when you were on the court in the various levels that you served in the judiciary? What was it like when a case came before you involving someone with a disability, in particular autism? I remember one important case that you decided, not to participate in, but that's just, no hard feelings about that one.
Actually, there was one case that came before me, came before the court. When I was on the New Jersey Supreme Court, a case came before us, and it was a criminal case involving somebody who was charged with sexual assault of a small child. And the reason he was charged with sexual assault of a small child was he was a piano teacher, and mom comes in one day and her little girl is sitting on this guy's lap. And that's pretty alarming if you're a person. Absolutely. But he was on the spectrum, and he thought if she was in his lap and he had his hands around her, he could show her. And so mom comes in, she gets hysterical, the guy gets charged and he got convicted. And so the issue when it came to the court had to do with whether or not he should have been permitted to have an expert testify about what autism is and how it might affect one's perception about social norms. We all know that the people on the spectrum don't have the same view of social norms as we do. Most of them don't have much of a social filter. And so the trial court judge has said, no, that's not allowed because you're basically giving an expert opinion that the guy isn't guilty. And the appellate division agreed with that. When it came to the court, the most telling moment, because I know how this one comes out, you can, and how it in fact came out was, under those circumstances, you could have somebody testify not about this guy's guilt or innocence, but to put in context what autism is and how it affects your thinking. So we go out, and I know how I mean, I have an open mind and all that sort of thing. And we go out into the courtroom, and it's a big courtroom. And I'm scanning the audience, because I was always scanning the audience, and I picked this guy out in a nanosecond. So we get to the end, and the Chief Justice stands up and says, the court will be in recess. And this fellow stands up and he starts yelling, wait, how come I don't get to talk? And I'm thinking, that's autism right there. And the rest of them were, what was that about? I said, that's autism. And said, oh. So I think that case might have come out differently if the other justices hadn't had some experience with me and my son, and watching my son in swearing in ceremonies and whatnot. So I like to think that it came in handy in a good way.
Educated some of the members of the court that didn't have the same experience as you did.
True.
One question comes from a parent that says, wanted to know what we can do to help students who have graduated from school into nothing because of COVID, and because they have lost the most. What your thoughts on that might be?
I don't know. In fact, when I was trying to think, because I was originally just trying to think of ideas myself, and then I decided, wait a minute, I've got a wealth of people here who know more than I do, and I wanted to tap into that. I think the biggest problem is for anybody who's not in the school. School's easy to come up with a theory. Everybody gets an extra year or whatnot of whatever you were getting. The people who were out in adult world, or maybe left with nothing because, okay, Johnny's home. And I always knew families like that who hadn't managed to put all the pieces together, and they ended up with a son or daughter at home. I don't know how we make that up to them. And I would really like other people to give me a clue. You can't just make jobs come from thin air, but what do we do there? I don't know. I don't know if those people get tacked on to an extra year in the school system, or what we do, because the entire adult system has gone into some kind of hyperspace, I guess. Well,
right. I mean, the entire adult system really has gone into a state of suspended animation. Mm-hmm. Work centers and day programs and community-based services for adults with special needs have only recently been authorized to reopen. Mm-hmm. And some programs that you may be familiar with, who serve both individuals on a residential and only day services basis, are taking the day services individuals first and on a limited capacity.
As well they should.
Right, as well.
I think the limited capacity, where you're taking the people who only had day services and you're leaving the people in the group homes to get whatever they're getting remotely, assuming they can understand that, but they're getting something. They're getting some kind of in-place programming. But when you then take the people who only got day services, I think that creates the ability to have social distancing in the work center, because you're not at full census. So that makes perfect sense to me. Those people really did end up with nothing.
Yeah, I mean, they ended up they had no real services at all. I mean, I have, as you know, Justice, I have an older brother who lives in a group home and in a provider agency. And, at least he's gotten something, right? Right. There's plenty of folks that go to program with him that really got nothing. Of course, in the case of my brother, he's very happy not to be doing anything. He thinks he's like reached early retirement and is really happy not to go to work anymore. And I'm really worried when he does have to go back, what he's going like how he's going to react then. I think behaviorally he's going to be like, what the, I've been like
Well,
off for a year. What are you
Yeah.
talking about?
And that was one of the things I was commenting on, relearning job skills, relearning how do you behave in a workplace. That's going to take everybody a while. But even being safe in a workplace. My son had, as of a year in August, gotten his first job ever. 35 years old, he gets his first job ever, and he's working on a Wawa. He can't go back to a Wawa anytime soon. I love them, and they're terrific, but how many people are in and out and all about? So my own thinking is for my son, until there's a reliable vaccine or something, he may not even be safe. He isn't going to keep a mask on.
Right.
His hands off his face.
Yeah. No, there's no way my brother's tolerating a mask either. He doesn't even like somebody, washing his face, helping him wash his face, much less putting on a mask.
Mm.
Question comes from a parent. How can parents band together to make a legislative change for special education? What's the process? Who do we address? Who are the players, et cetera? It's a great question. I mean, it's a multi-part question.
It's a terrific question.
Yeah.
It's a terrific question. I think we're at the step where we figure out, do we have some common interests, whatever they may be? Do we have a menu of common interests? And we then decide how to approach the people who you would need to approach. So for example, if we're going to talk about school age kids and we're going to look for, everybody gets another year or something, the legislature will be appalled, but there's at least some basis to say, hey, come on. And they just got authorized by my former colleagues to borrow several $billion, so they ought to be throwing some of it at our kids. That's what I think. So what you then do is you typically have somebody who knows what they're doing create a draft of the legislation. We would probably, as parents, not just do it as parents. We might start trying to see, can we get Autism NJ or some providers or somebody to come together. I don't know who might be amenable to that. But then what you would do is you would look for a sponsor. So typically you would be looking for somebody who cares about autism or disabilities. Because it wouldn't just be for autism. Positions of authority of the legislature or people who are interested in these sorts of things. The Senate president would probably be semi-amenable to this. But what I would do if I were doing this is try and get bipartisan support. Our legislature is overwhelmingly, it's dominated by the Democrats, which is fine, but you don't want to leave the Republicans out of the loop. You want them to as many support notes.
Okay, Justice, we're gonna let your computer buffer a little bit because at least on my end, I think that you're freezing up and you're stuttering a little bit. Your video is freezing up. So what my experience is, if we just let your computer rest for a minute or two or a second or two, it'll catch up. So, but I think the remarks came through. They just came through a little broken or a little frozen, then came through. So. Everybody take a deep breath. Maybe Justice Hoens can lead us all in a meditation. We talked about, apparently you're leading meditation.
I can. If you want that, you need to send me an email. I'll think about whether But the point is there are processes for these things, and there are ways to generate support. And we do that by coming up with a game plan and being organized about the approach. You can't have everybody on the list deciding, oh, I'm going to do this. You've got to have a game plan. This is something that started popping into my head a few days ago. So,
Right. And also, I think is a good piece of advice, just having been around this stuff for a little while, you also have to anticipate who the opposition will be and what their opposition will be and how to address their concerns, right?
Yes.
And make it palatable to the potential opposition, knowing that you can never figure out who the opposition will be or what all the concerns will be. But it's not easy, but it can be. Nothing's been done. I can say this: nothing, in my experience, nothing legislatively has ever been accomplished in the disability community without a groundswell of parent support. I mean, if you look back a few years ago, when the Division of Developmental Disabilities was trying to return people back to the state of New Jersey who were placed in out-of-state placements under this program they called Return Home New Jersey, it was parents that freaked out, dealt with the legislature. This firm, Maria Fisher, my partner Maria Fisher, and I, we're very involved in the process of drafting legislation and supporting parents. And it was the parents, though, and their contact and their, for lack of a better term, but I mean with a great deal of respect, badgering the various members of the legislature until it got enough attention to put an end to what was a very ill-conceived and poorly advised plan to return people to New Jersey when they had been in very good placements for, in some cases, decades. So it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
It creates it requires a groundswell of parents to be relentless when it comes to legislative initiatives. So, unlike judges who are impervious to the will of the somebody come and say, liked your visual of the cliff, right? And I do too. I like the visual of the cliff when the student ages out of a school district or their educational entitlement. And the concern is for those students who maybe have slipped through the cracks through the educational system, and then they get out of this educational services and they need services as an adult, but they maybe have never been diagnosed or never have been accurately diagnosed as a child. And that often involves, Justice, as I think the kids at the upper end of the spectrum. I hate to use those terms,
Yes.
but kids on the Asperger's end of the spectrum.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I think we have really frozen up. Hang on, people. It's gonna unfreeze.
In the course of the pandemic, their adult son or daughter started doing things that make, so I don't know. I think there's a bunch of those folks who are going to be in need of some kind of support. So.
Okay, guys, we're going to take a slight. We're gonna do something here that I hope doesn't make matters worse as opposed to better. Justice, why don't you mute your computer, your thing, Watch me, guys. Welcome to the offices of Hinkle, Pryor, and Fisher. We're moving around. No, we're not changing the network.
Okay. All right, good idea.
It looks like we're in different locations, but we're really in the same building. Just in different offices.
Hello.
Hello. Okay. Thank you. There's going to be a slight echo for a minute. Are you in the screen?
Yes.
Knock yourself out.
I have to crunch down now to get on the, oh, I see what he did. Okay. I'll crunch down.
You might want to repeat the last answer, the last question while I try to figure out,
I have no idea what it was. Okay.
It was kids who
Okay.
fell off this cliff.
Okay. Yeah, I started getting, I've gotten a couple of calls from people who had an adult daughter, actually, who in the course of the pandemic started having some issues that they now appear that they may be on the spectrum somewhere. So I remember back in the old days, and I'm sure Paul knows more about it than I do, that you had to be diagnosed by a certain age or you weren't on the spectrum. So I don't know if that's changed, but that's potentially troublesome. I don't know how you serve those folks. I think Paul has run away from me, so now I'm really in charge. I know you hear me because you're laughing. It's my best material. Okay. And I believe I may even be the host here. Somebody asked about autism parents silenced by the self-advocacy movement. Do I have any advice? Well, the self-advocacy movement was kind of starting when my son was growing up. There was Temple Grandin, who really, she's amazing. But then there were all these other people who became self-advocates. The concern I always had about the self-advocates is that because they are on the spectrum, they typically don't have empathy with anybody other than themselves. And so they, over time, have, I think, become not simply advocates for themselves, but advocates, they believe, for everybody else. And what they need is nowhere near what I need, or maybe what any of you need. And yet, I remember there was a point in time when some of them really were becoming very vociferous about, we'll speak for people with autism, not somebody's mother. I think I don't like to sit around and get criticized, but the reality is, to some extent, it's like other kinds of criticism on the internet. You sort of have to tolerate that a certain amount of that is going to come at you. I'm pretty sure some of the things if I were to tell you the stories about my son, people would find some of my views to be troublesome, because I come from a world where my son is so disabled. So I don't think there's anything, I don't think the self-advocates are going to stop being critical of the rest of us. I think we just need to move forward. And frankly, Why shouldn't whatever we're looking for include services that might benefit them as well? I don't know. Maybe they don't want our help. That's okay too. I'm kind of, I don't want to make a political statement, but I'm a big tent person. You know, let's bring everybody in.
Judge, you did say before you think you had all the control, and now you do. You really do. So so this should be familiar. Somebody asked this, and we'll only take a couple more, and then we'll let you go. How do we access the survey that you talked about before? Again, I think I can feel that we might find other ways to distribute this, but at least at a minimum, we as a firm are going to distribute that survey to the 600 plus people who have signed up for this workshop. Judge, there's a fair number of questions of, whether we can contact you or how do we contact you. I don't know if that's something you want to field.
The survey does include the last question on the survey, because I'm working with free SurveyMonkey. I only do free services. So you only have 10 questions. So I made the 10th question. If you're willing to help, put down, do you have an adult or a child or whatever, and give me your contact information. So I can do that.
Right, and then you can contact that.
I actually occasionally give out an email for me, but when I do that, it tends to go a little viral, and I start getting people trying to sell me land in some place or other, or
right.
So
Right. If you have a Wikipedia page, you probably shouldn't have, an email address for people to contact you.
My brother about that. I didn't even know about it.
There is a comment which I fully support. Someone asking a very good question is, can you run for Congress? So I'm not sure why we would stop there. So
years back, I gave a speech. About I got a whole bunch of awards when I left the bench, and basically I was giving this speech about, they gave me this huge award, and the speech that I gave was, why don't you invite me back in 15 years and see if I deserve this award? I haven't done anything. And one of the things that I said was, listen, as long as there are people who don't have representation when they need it, people who are homeless, and I had this whole long list of stuff that, people who are suffering in poverty or don't have enough to eat or whatever. He says, as long as there's all those people, it was a long list. It was unscripted, another one of my unscripted speeches, which is why I don't remember it. And I get to the end and I said, as long as any of that is going on, I haven't finished my work. So so there was a table, this was a bunch of lawyers. So there was a table saying, oh yeah, we got to get her to run for governor's office. I'm thinking, oh, no, I don't want to, politics is, no, thanks.
not your ball. It's not your game, right?
You have to go out and raise money. I'm no good at that.
Right.
Unless you can settle cheesecakes door to door, which.
If anyone can sell cheesecakes door to door in the 1980s, they can raise money to run for Congress. So
frozen box you're pulling behind you? Oh, not really.
I'm sure this was the finest in culinary experiences. Justice, we are really running low on time, and this thing will cut out on its own if we don't say goodbye in an orderly fashion. Again, Justice, there's a lot of comments of thank you and how inspirational you were and how great you were, and somebody says disabled lives matter, exclamation point. That's a great one too. So DLM all the way. So thank you for being here. Thank you everybody for listening to Justice Hoens. I hope that you got a lot out of it, and I hope you feel better. Somebody says, were those Michelle Laurie cheesecakes? I mean, I guess that's a thing. I don't know.
They were. Got them down in Trenton, and they were so good. They were so good. Yes. Oh, they were terrific.
Easy.
I think I've missed out on an experience. I need to go. So if someone's selling them, send one to me. I'll buy it. So, so anyway, thank you, Justice Hoens, and thank you, everybody, for being here. We'll see you all tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And until then, have a good evening, and we'll see you down the road. Thanks again.
Thank you all.
Thank you for watching this encore presentation from the Fall 2020 Hinkle, Pryor and Fisher Parent Empowerment Conference. With 24 other presentations to view, there is plenty of additional information to help you become empowered. As a reminder, the information contained in this video is not a substitute for individual legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Copyright 2020 Hinkle, Pryor and Fisher, PC, Attorneys at Law. All rights reserved.